Chapters 49 through 52 of A Poor Wise Man by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 49. Howard went back to the municipal building, driving furiously through the empty streets. The news was ominous. Small bodies of men, avoiding the highways, were focusing at different points in the open country. The state police had been fired at from ambush, and 2 of them had been killed. They had ridden into and dispersed various gatherings in the darkness, but only to have them reform in other places. The enemy was still shadowy, elusive. It was apparently saving its ammunition. It did little shooting, but reports of the firing of farmhouses and of buildings in small unprotected towns began to come in rapidly. In a short time the messages began to be more significant, indicating that the groups were coalescing, and that a revolutionary army, with the city its objective, was coming down the river, evidently making for the bridge at Chester Street. "They've lighted a fire they can't put out," was Howard's comment. His mouth was very dry and his face twitching, for he saw behind the frail barrier of the Chester Street bridge the quiet houses of the city, the sleeping children. He saw Grace and Lily and Eleanor. He was among the first to reach the riverfront. All through the dawn volunteers labored at the bridge head. Members of the Vigilance Committee, policemen and firemen, doctors, lawyers, clerks, shopkeepers, they looted the river wharves with willing, unskillful hands. They turned coal wagons on their sides, carried packing cases and boxes, and under the direction of men who wore the Legion button, built skillfully and well. Willy Cameron toiled with the others. He lifted and pulled and struggled, and in the midst of his labor he had again that old dream of the city. The city was a vast number of units, and those units were homes. Behind each of those men there was, somewhere in some quiet neighborhood, a home. It was for their homes they were fighting, for the right of children to play in peaceful streets, for the right to go back at night to the rest they had earned by honest labor, for the right of the hearth, of lamplight and sunlight, of love, of happiness. Then, in the flare of a gasoline torch, he came face to face with Louis Akers. The 2 men confronted each other, silently, with hostility. Neither moved aside, but it was Akers who spoke first. "Always busy, Cameron," he said. "What'd the world do without you, anyhow?" "Aren't you on the wrong side of this barricade?" "Smart as ever," Akers observed, watching him intently. "As it happens, I'm here because I want to be, and because I can't get where I ought to be." For a furious moment Willy Cameron thought he was referring to his wife, but there was something strange in Akers' tone. "I could be useful to you fellows," he was saying, "but it seems you don't want help. I've been trying to see the mayor all night." "What do you want to see him about?" "I'll tell him that." Willy Cameron hesitated. "I think it's a trick, Akers." "All right. Then go to the devil." He turned away sullenly, leaving Willy Cameron still undecided. It would be like the man as he knew him, this turning informer, when he saw the strength of the defense, and Cameron had a flash of intuition, too, that Akers might see, in this new role, some possible chance to win back with Lily Cardew. He saw how the man's cheap soul might dramatize itself. "Akers!" he called. Akers stopped, but he did not turn. "I've got a car here. If you mean what you say, and it's straight, I'll take you." "Where's the car?" On their way to it, threading in and out among the toiling crowd, Willy Cameron had a chance to observe the change in the other man, his drooping shoulders and the almost lassitude of his walk. He went ahead, charging the mass and going through it by sheer bulk and weight, his hands in his coat pockets, his soft hat pulled low over his face. Neither of them noticed that one of the former clerks of the Myers House Cleaning Company followed close behind, or that, holding to a tire, he rode on the rear of the Cardew automobile as it made its way into the center of the city. In the car, Akers spoke only once. "Where is Howard Cardew?" he asked. "With the mayor, probably. I left him there." It seemed to him that Akers found the answer satisfactory. He sat back in the deep seat and lighted a cigarette. The municipal building was under guard. Willy Cameron went up the steps and spoke to the sentry there. It was while his back was turned that the sharp crack of a revolver rang out, and he whirled, in time to see Louis Akers fall forward on his face, and lie still. The shadowy groups through the countryside had commenced to coalesce. Groups of 20 became a rabble of 500. The 500 grew and joined other 500s. From Baxter alone over 2,000 rioters, mostly foreigners, started out, and by daylight the main body of the enemy reached the outskirts of the city, a long, irregular line of laughing, jostling, shouting men, constantly renewed at the rear until the procession covered miles of roadway. They were of all races and all types. Individually they were, many of them, like boys playing truant from school, not quite certain of themselves, smiling and yet uneasy, not entirely wicked in intent. But they were shepherded by men with cunning eyes, men who knew well that a mob is greater than the sum of its parts, more wicked than the individuals who compose it, more cruel, more courageous. As it marched, it laughed. It was like a lion at play, ready to leap at the first scratch that brought blood. Where the street-car line met the Friendship Road, the advance was met by the chief of police, on horseback and followed by a guard of mounted men, and ordered back. The van hesitated, but it was urged ahead, pushed on by the irresistible force behind it, and it came on no longer singing, but slowly, inevitably, sullenly protesting and muttering. Its good nature was gone. As the chief turned, his horse was shot under him. He took another horse from one of his guard, and they retired, moving slowly with drawn revolvers. There was no further shooting at that time, nothing but the irresistible advance. The police could no more have held the armed rabble than they could have held the invading hordes in Belgium. At the end of the street the chief stopped and looked back. They had passed over his dead horse as though it were not there. In the mill district, which they now had reached, they received reinforcements, justifying the judgment of the conference that to have erected their barricades there would have been to expose the city's defenders to attack from the rear. And the mill district suffered comparatively little. It was the business portion of the city toward which they turned their covetous eyes, the great stores, the hotels and restaurants, the homes of the wealthy. Pleased by the lack of opposition, the mob grew more cheerful. The lion played. They pressed forward, wanton and jeering, firing now and then at random, breaking windows as they passed, looting small shops which they stripped like locusts. Their pockets bulging and the taste of pillage forecasting what was to come, they moved onward more rapidly, shooting at upper windows or into the air, laughing, yelling, cursing, talking. From the barricades, long before the miles-long column came into view, could be heard the ominous far-off muttering of the mob. It was when they found the bridge barricaded on the far side, however, that the lion bared its teeth and snarled. Temporarily checked by the play of machine guns which swept the bridge and kept it clear for a time, they commenced wild, wasteful firing, from the bridgehead and from along the Cardew wharves. Their leaders were prepared, and sent snipers into the bridge towers, but the machine guns continued to fire. That the struggle would be on the bridge Doyle and his council had anticipated from the reports of the night before. They were prepared to take a heavy loss on the bridges, but they had not prepared for the thing that defeated them, that as the mob is braver than the individual, so also it is more cowardly. Pushed forward from the rear and unable to retreat through the dense mass behind that was every moment growing denser, a few hundred found themselves facing the steady machine gun fire from behind the barricades, and unable either to advance or to retire. Thus trapped, they turned on their own forces behind them, and tried to fight their way to safety, but the inexorable pressure kept on, and the defenders, watching and powerless, saw men fling themselves from the bridges and disappear in the water below, rather than advance into the machine gun zone. The guns were not firing into the rioters, but before them to hold them back, and into that leaden stream there were no brave spirits to hurl themselves. The trapped men turned on their own and battled for escape. With the same violence which had been directed toward the city, they now fought each other, and the bridge slowly cleared. But the mob did not disperse. It spread out on the bank across, a howling, frustrated, futile mass, disorganized and demoralized, which fired its useless guns across the river, which seethed and tossed and struggled, and spent itself in its own wild fury. And all the time, cool-eyed men on the wharves across watched and waited for the time to attack. "They're sick at their stomachs now," said an old army sergeant watching, to Willy Cameron. "The dirty devils! They'll be starting their filthy work over there soon, and that's the 0 hour." Willy Cameron nodded. He had seen one young Russian boy with a childlike face venture forward alone into the fire zone and drop. He still lay there, on the bridge. And all of Willy Cameron was in revolt. What had he been told, that boy, that had made him ready to pour out his young life like wine? There were others like him in that milling multitude on the river bank across, young men who had come to America with a dream in their hearts, and America had done this to them. Or had she? She had taken them in, but they were not her own, and now, since she would not take them, they would take her. Was that it? Was it that America had made them her servants, but not her children? He did not know. Robbed of the city proper, the mob turned on the mill district it had invaded. Its dream of lust and greed was over, but it could still destroy. Like a battle charge, as indeed it was, the mounted city and state police crossed the bridge. It was followed by the state troops on foot, by city policemen in orderly files, and then by the armed citizens. The bridge vibrated to the step of marching men going out to fight for their homes. The real battle was fought there, around the Cardew mills, a battle where the loyalists were greatly outnumbered, and where the rioters fought, according to their teaching, with every trick they could devise. Posted in upper windows, they fired down from comparative safety. Ambulances crossed and recrossed the bridges. The streets were filled with rioting men, striking out murderously with bars and spikes. Fires flamed up and burned themselves out. In one place, 8 blocks of mill workers' houses with their furnishings went in a quarter of an hour. Willy Cameron was fighting like a demon. Long ago his reserve of ammunition had given out, and he was fighting with the butt end of his revolver. Around him had rallied some of the men he knew best, Pink and Mr. Hendricks, Dr. Smalley, Dan and Joe Wilkinson, and they stayed together as, street by street, the revolutionists were driven back. There were dead and wounded everywhere, injured men who had crawled into the shelter of doorways, and sat or lay there nursing their wounds. Suddenly, to his amazement, Willy saw old Anthony Cardew. He had somehow achieved an upper window of the mill office building, and he was showing himself fearlessly, a rifle in his hands. In his face was a great anger, but there was more than that. Willy Cameron, thinking it over later, decided it was perplexity. He could not understand. He never did understand. For other eyes also had seen old Anthony Cardew. Willy Cameron, breasting the mob and fighting madly toward the door of the building, with Pink behind him, heard a cheer and an angry roar, and, looking up, saw that the old man had disappeared. They found him there later on, the rifle beside him, his small and valiant figure looking, with eyes no longer defiant, toward the heaven which puts, for its own strange purpose, both evil and good into the same heart. By 11 o'clock the revolution was over. Sodden groups of men, thoroughly cowed and frightened, were on their way by back roads to the places they had left a few hours before. They had no longer dreams of empire. Behind them they could see, on the horizon, the city itself, the smoke from its chimneys, the spires of its churches. Both homes and churches they had meant to destroy, but behind both there was the indestructible. They had failed. They turned, looked back, and went on. On the crest of a hilltop overlooking the city a man was standing, looking down to where the softened towers of the great steel bridges rose above the river mist like fairy towers. Behind him lay the city, powerful, significant, important. The man saw the city only as a vast crucible, into which he had flung his all, and out of which had come only defeat and failure. But the city was not a crucible. The melting pot of a nation is not a thing of cities, but of the human soul. The city was not a melting pot. It was a sanctuary. The man stood silent and morose, his chin dropped on his chest, and stared down. Beside and somewhat behind him stood a woman, a somber, passionate figure, waiting passively. His eyes traveled from the city to her, and rested on her, contemptuous, thwarted, cynical. "You fool," he said. "I hate you, and you know it." But she only smiled faintly. "We'd better get away now, Jim," she said. He got into the car. Chapter 50. Late that afternoon Joe Wilkinson and Dan came slowly up the street toward the Boyd house. The light of battle was still in Dan's eyes, his clothes were torn and his collar missing, and he walked with the fine swagger of the conqueror. "You ask me," he said, "and I'll tell the world this thing's done for. It was just as well to let them give it a try and find out it won't work." Joe said nothing. He was white and very tired and a little sick. "If you don't mind, I'll go in your place and wash up," he remarked as they neared the house. "I'll scare the kids to death if they see me like this." Edith was in the parlor. She had sat there almost all day, in an agony of fear. At 4:00 the smallest Wilkinson had hammered at the front door, and on being admitted had made a shameless demand. "Bed and thugger," she had said, looking up with an ingratiating smile. "You little beggar." "Bed and thugger." Edith had got the bread and sugar, and having lured the baby into the parlor, had held her while she ate, receiving now and then an exceedingly sticky kiss in payment. After a little the child's head began to droop, and Edith drew the small head down onto her breast. She sat there, rocking gently, while the chair slowly traveled according to its wont about the room. The child brought her comfort. She began to understand those grave rocking figures in the hospital ward, women who sat with eyes that seemed to look into distant places, with a child's head on their breasts. After all, that was life for a woman. Love was only a part of the scheme of life, a means to an end. And that end was the child. For the first time she wished that her child had lived. She felt no bitterness now, and no anger. He was dead. It was hard to think of him as dead, who had been so vitally alive. She was sorry he had had to die, but death was like love and children, it was a part of some general scheme of things. Suppose this had been his child she was holding. Would she so easily have forgiven him? She did not know. Then she thought of Willy Cameron. The bitterness had strangely gone out of that too. Perhaps vaguely she began to realize that only young love gives itself passionately and desperately, when there is no hope of a return, and that the agonies of youth, although terrible enough, pass with youth itself. She felt very old. Joe found her there, the chair displaying its usual tendency to climb the chimney flue, and stood in the doorway looking at her with haunted, hungry eyes. There was a sort of despair in Joe those days, and now he was tired and shaken from the battle. "I'll take her home in a minute," he said, still with the strange eyes. He came into the room, and suddenly he was kneeling beside the chair, his head buried against the baby's warm, round body. His bent shoulders shook, and Edith, still with the maternal impulse strong within her, put her hand on his bowed head. "Don't, Joe." He looked up. "I loved you so, Edith." "Don't you love me now?" "God knows I do. I can't get over it. I can't. I've tried, Edith." He sat back on the floor and looked at her. "I can't," he repeated. "And when I saw you like that just now with the kid in your arms, I used to think that maybe you and I—" "I know, Joe. No decent man would want me now." She was still strangely composed, peaceful, almost detached. "That?" he said, astonished. "I don't mean that, Edith. I've had my fight about that and got it over. That's done with. I mean—" He got up and straightened himself. "You don't care about me." "But I do care for you. Perhaps not quite the way you care, Joe, but I've been through a lot. I can't seem to feel anything terribly. I just want peace." "I could give you that," he said eagerly. Edith smiled. Peace in that noisy house next door, with children and kittens and puppies everywhere. And yet it would be peace after all, the peace of the soul, the peace of a good man's love. After a time, too, there might come another peace, the peace of those tired women in the ward, rocking. "If you want me, I'll marry you," she said very simply. "I'll be a good wife, Joe, and I want children. I want the right to have them." He never noticed that the kiss she gave him over the sleeping baby was slightly tinged with granulated sugar. Chapter 51. Old Anthony's body had been brought home and lay in state in his great bed. There had been a bad hour. Death seemed so strangely to erase faults and leave virtues. Something strong and vital had gone from the house, and the servants moved about with cautious, noiseless steps. In Grace's boudoir, Howard was sitting, his arms around his wife, telling her the story of the day. At dawn he had notified her by telephone of Akers' murder. "Shall I tell Lily?" she had asked, trembling. "Do you want to wait until I get back?" "I don't know how she will take it, Howard. I wish you could be here, anyhow." But then had come the battle and his father's death, and in the end it was Willy Cameron who told her. He had brought back all that was mortal of Anthony Cardew, and having seen the melancholy procession up the stairs, had stood in the hall, hating to intrude but hoping to be useful. Howard found him there, a strange disheveled figure bearing the scars of battle, and held out his hand. "It's hard to thank you, Cameron," he said. "You seem to be always about when we need help. And," he paused, "we seem to have needed it considerably lately." Willy Cameron flushed. "I feel rather like a meddler, sir." "Better go up and wash," Howard said. "I'll go up with you." It happened, therefore, that it was in Howard Cardew's opulent dressing room that Howard first spoke to Willy Cameron of Akers' death, pacing the floor as he did so. "I haven't told her, Cameron." He was anxious and puzzled. "She'll have to be told soon, of course. I don't know anything about women. I don't know how she'll take it. She has a great deal of courage. It will be a shock, but not a grief. But I have been thinking." Willy Cameron hesitated. "She must not feel any remorse," he went on. "She must not feel that she contributed to it in any way. If you can make that clear to her." "Are you sure she did not?" "It isn't facts that matter now. We can't help those. And no one can tell what actually led to his change of heart. It is what she is to think the rest of her life." Howard nodded. "I wish you would tell her," he said. "I'm a blundering fool when it comes to her. I suppose I care too much." He caught rather an odd look in Willy Cameron's face at that, and pondered over it later. "I will tell her if you wish." And Howard drew a deep breath of relief. It was shortly after that he broached another matter, rather diffidently. "I don't know whether you realize it or not, Cameron," he said, "but this thing today might have been a different story if it had not been for you. And don't think I'm putting this on a reward basis. It's nothing of the sort. But I would like to feel that you were working with me. I'd hate like thunder to have you working against me," he added. "I am only trained for one thing." "We use chemists in the mills." But the discussion ended there. Both men knew that it would be taken up later at some more opportune time, and in the meantime both had one thought: Lily. So it happened that Lily heard the news of Louis Akers' death from Willy Cameron. She stood straight and erect, and heard him through, watching him with eyes sunken by her night's vigil and by the strain of the day. But it seemed to her that he was speaking of someone she had known long ago, in some infinitely remote past. "I am sorry," she said when he finished. "I didn't want him to die. You know that, don't you? I never wished him. Willy, I say I'm sorry, but I don't really feel anything. It's dreadful." Before he could catch her, she had fallen to the floor, fainting for the first time in her healthy young life. An hour later Mademoiselle went down to the library door. She found Willy Cameron pacing the floor, a pipe clenched in his teeth, and a look of wild despair in his eyes. Mademoiselle took a long breath. She had changed her viewpoint somewhat since the spring. After all, what mattered was happiness. Wealth and worldly ambition were well enough, but they brought one, in the end, to the thing which waited for all in some quiet upstairs room, with the shades drawn, and the heavy odors of hothouse flowers over everything. "She is all right, quite, Mr. Cameron," she said. "It was but a crisis of the nerves, and to be expected. And now she demands to see you." Grayson, standing in the hall, had a swift vision of a tall figure, which issued with extreme rapidity from the library door and went up the stairs, much like a horse taking a series of hurdles. But the figure lost momentum suddenly at the top, hesitated, and apparently moved forward on tiptoe. Grayson went into the library and sniffed at the unmistakable odor of a pipe. Then, having opened a window, he went and stood before a great portrait of old Anthony Cardew. Tears stood in the old man's eyes, but there was a faint smile on his lips. He saw the endless procession of life. First love, then out of love, life. Then death, Grayson was old, but he had lived to see young love in the Cardew house. Out of love, life. He addressed a little speech to the picture. "Wherever you are, sir," he said, "you needn't worry any more. The line will carry on, sir. The line will carry on." Upstairs in the little boudoir, Willy Cameron knelt beside the couch and gathered Lily close in his arms. Chapter 52. Thanksgiving of the year of our Lord 1919 saw many changes. It saw, slowly emerging from the chaos of war, new nations, like children taking their first feeble steps. It saw a socialism which, born at full term, might have thrived, prematurely and forcibly delivered, and making a valiant but losing fight for life. It saw that war is never good, but always evil. That war takes everything and gives nothing, save that sometimes a man may lose the whole world and gain his own soul. It saw old Anthony Cardew gone to his fathers, into the vast democracy of heaven, and Louis Akers passed through the traitor's gate of eternity to be judged and perhaps reprieved. For a man is many men, good and bad, and the judge of the Tower of Heaven is a just judge. It saw Jim Doyle a fugitive, Woslosky dead, and the Russian Ross, bland, cunning, and eternally plotting in New England under another name. And Mr. Hendricks ordering a new suit for the day of taking office. And Dr. Smalley tying a bunch of chrysanthemums on Annabelle against a football game, and taking a pretty nurse to see it. It saw Ellen roasting a turkey, and a strange young man in the Eagle Pharmacy, a young man who did not smoke a pipe, and allowed no visitors in the back room. And it saw Willy Cameron in the laboratory of the reopened Cardew mills, dealing in tons instead of grains and drams, and learning to touch any piece of metal in the mill with a moistened forefinger before he sat down upon it. But it saw more than that. On the evening of Thanksgiving Day there was an air of repressed excitement about the Cardew house. Mademoiselle, in a new silk dress, ran about the lower floor, followed by an agitated Grayson with a cloth, for Mademoiselle was shifting ceaselessly and with trembling hands vases of flowers, and spilling water at each shift. At 6:00 had arrived a large square white box, which the footman had carried to the rear and there exhibited, allowing a palpitating cook, scullery maid, and divers other excitable and emotional women to peep within. After which he tied it up again and carried it upstairs. At 7:00 Eleanor Cardew, lovely in black satin, was carried down the stairs and placed in a position which commanded both the hall and the drawing room. For some strange reason, it was essential that she should see both. At 7:30 came in a rush. Mr. Alston Denslow, in evening clothes and gardenia, and feeling in his right waistcoat pocket nervously every few minutes. B. An excited woman of middle age, in a black silk dress still faintly bearing the creases of 5 days in a trunk, and accompanied by a mongrel dog, both being taken upstairs by Grayson, Mademoiselle, Pink, and Howard Cardew. "He said Jinx was to come," she explained breathlessly to her bodyguard. "I never knew such a boy." C. Mr. Davis, in a frock coat and white lawn tie, and taken upstairs by Grayson, who mistook him for the bishop. D. Aunt Caroline, in her diamond dog collar and purple velvet, and determined to make the best of things. E. The real bishop this time, and his assistant, followed by a valet with a suitcase, containing the proper habiliments for a prince of the church while functioning. A military term, since the bishop had been in the army. F. A few important people, very curious, and the women uncertain about the proper garb for a festive occasion in a house of mourning. G. Set of silver table vases, belated. H. Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks, Mayor and Mayoress-elect. Extremely dignified. I. An overfull taxicab, containing inside it Ellen, Edith, Dan, and Joe. The overflow consisting of a tall young man displaying repressed excitement and new evening clothes, with gardenia, sat on the seat outside beside the chauffeur and repeated to himself a sort of chant accompanied by furious searchings of his pockets. Money, checkbook, tickets, trunk checks, was the burden of his song. And finally J, Dr. Smalley, and Annabelle. He left Annabelle outside. The city moved on about its business. In thousands of homes the light shone down on little family groups, infinitely tender little groups. The workers of the city were there, the doors shut, the fires burning. To each man the thing he had earned, not the thing that he took. To all men the right to labor, to love, and to rest. To children the right to play. To women the hearth, and the peace of the hearth. To lovers, love and marriage, and home. The city moved on about its business, and its business was homes. At the great organ behind the staircase the organist sat. In stiff rows near him were the Cardew servants, marshaled by Grayson and in their best. Grayson stood very rigid and waited. And as he waited he kept his eyes on the portrait of old Anthony in the drawing-room beyond. There was a fixed, rapt look in Grayson's eyes, and there was reassurance. It was as though he would say to the portrait, "It has all come out very well, you see, sir. It always works out somehow. We worry and fret, we old ones, but the young come along, and somehow or other they manage, sir." What he actually said was to tell a housemaid to stop sniveling. Over the house was the strange hush of waiting. It had waited before this, for birth and for death, but never before. The bishop was waiting also, and he too had his eyes fixed on old Anthony's portrait, a straight level-eyed gaze, as of a man to man, as of a prince of the church to prince of industry. The bishop's eyes said, "All shall be done properly and in order, and as befits the Cardews, Anthony." The bishop was as successful in his line as Anthony Cardew had been in his. He cleared his throat. The organist sat at the great organ behind the staircase, waiting. He was playing very softly, with his eyes turned up. He had played the same music many times before, and always he felt very solemn, as one who makes history. He sighed. Sometimes it seemed to him that he was only an accompaniment to life, to which others sang and prayed, were christened, confirmed, and married. But what was the song without the music? He wished the scullery maid would stop crying. Grayson touched him on the arm. "All ready, sir," he said. Willy Cameron stood at the foot of the staircase, looking up. End of chapters 49 through 52. End of A Poor Wise Man by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Recorded by Céline Major.